What's up, everyone? Coach Tony back on the water, more fishing, more thinking about life and training. Just had our first bite literally seconds after my lure hit the water, so that's a good sign. I know I said the same thing last time, but I have a good feeling we're gonna catch a fish this time. So what I wanted to talk about this week was a question that a lifter asked me pretty recently. We've got 6 lifters headed to a national event coming up. I was chatting with some of them about what they wanted to do after the meet was over, after they've been doing a pretty serious meet prep block and a lot of specificity, a lot of heavy training in the competition style squat, bench, and deadlift. And the question that one of them asked was, should competitive powerlifters have an off season? And I think first it's important to kind of define what an off season is. And that's a little easier to define if you're training somebody, say for like team-based sports, because obviously there is a competitive season where they're training, to get ready for competitive games very soon. There's a deep off season, when there are no competitive games coming up. And then there's kind of like that middle ground where it's more like preseason, like, okay, we don't have any competitions coming up right away, but we are training with the intent of getting better at our sport. With powerlifters, the training and the sport are quite literally the same. So that can actually make it a little bit tricky. Like, how do you train? How do you do off-season training for a powerlifter? And I think it depends on a couple of things. First of all, it depends on how that individual lifter is feeling. I try to communicate very closely with my lifters in person and online. I try to get a gauge for them at all times, kind of what their general enthusiasm for training is. I think that's number one. Like, if they are mentally in it and they're feeling good and they want to continue to train heavy, then I don't think you need quite as off-season a style program as what you might normally give, where it's a lot of non-specific movements and the weights are very light. But if it's somebody who is like, I'm burnt out, like I don't want to think about heavy barbell training again for a long time, then okay, maybe you give a more off-season style program with some more of that non-specific training. So it depends on how they're feeling from an enthusiasm standpoint. Next, it depends on how they are from a health standpoint. As I've talked about before, training for health and performance are not the same thing. And a lot of times the type of training that make us best at heavy barbell training and best at competitive powerlifting beat us up a little bit. Might have some overuse injuries, our joints might be a little achy, we might have some minor nagging injuries that we need to clear up. And in that case, then yes, I think it's important to have a period of non-specific training. Take away the thing that's beating you up. If you have a headache because you keep bashing your head up against the wall, don't just give them some Advil. Stop bashing your head against the wall. Take away the thing that is causing the pain in the first place. So if the athlete is relatively healthy, there's no injuries to speak of that you need to clear up, then by all means, resume heavy barbell training as you see fit. If they are pretty beat up, then yeah, you might need a period of non-specific training to allow those injuries to kind of subside a little bit. And then you got to ask yourself, what level of experience does that lifter have, and what is kind of the lowest hanging fruit as far as the strength quality that we're going to want to build up to make them better. And we're going to make some generalizations here. Every lifter is different, but in general, I think that beginners, more novice lifters, need less what you might call like phases or blocks in their training. I am not a big proponent of kind of traditional what you would call block periodization. This is kind of like a classic like American way to think of strength and conditioning. Way, if any of you have ever been a member of the National Strength and Conditioning Association, gotten your CSCS, they probably talk a lot about like block periodization, where you have like a distinct phase of training where you focus on hypertrophy, gaining muscle. You have a phase of more like general strength where you focus on just like kind of non-specific strength. And then you have a period where you might call it like power or peaking, where you're getting ready to display your 1 rep max strength in the case of powerlifting. And I don't think that's a great way to train for pretty much anybody. You don't have to be that distinct or blocked, quite literally blocked in your training approach. I think you can train a little bit of everything all year round. It's just whatever quality is emphasized the most during that period. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you've followed along with any of my more specific programming stuff, I talked about how I like to use, I've started to use heavier singles for the squat, bench, and deadlift pretty much year round. So whether we're, deep in an off season, or we're kind of like in a, maybe 12 weeks out from a meet, or whether we're, 2 or 3 weeks out from a meet, heavy singles are a mainstay in our programming because that's our sport. We want to maintain some level of specificity all year round. But if it's more during the off season, maybe those singles are in like the 6 or 7 RPE range, so they're heavy enough to maintain some skill of performing the heavy singles, but they're not so heavy that they're really going to beat us up. And there's certainly no risk of missing those singles. We're going to attempt weights that we are not going to successfully complete. But more the bulk of our training, the more the volume that we're doing is maybe more something that looks like a hypertrophy block, where it's a little bit more, okay, we're doing sets of like 6 to 12 reps. We're stopping, 1 to 3 reps shy of failure to help build up muscle. But we are keeping those heavy singles in to some degree. I think that more novice lifters don't need to mix up their training quite as much, and they don't need to take quite as much time away from their heavy lifts, their heavy competition style lifts. They can kind of train similarly almost all year round. Their outputs aren't quite as high yet. You've heard me say like beginners just can't wreck themselves the way that a more advanced lifter can. Because an advanced lifter has a little bit higher outputs, they're able to kind of empty the tank, so to speak, a little more readily. They should have more periods of training where they're a little bit less specific and not doing quite as many, really, really heavy singles or heavy sets of 3 to 5 in their training. That can be tough because I've said it before, a peaking block, it takes a little bit longer for an advanced lifter to kind of ramp up to their greatest abilities. If you're a 700-pound squatter, it will probably take you a lot longer to kind of go from weight that you're using for hypertrophy training to weight that you're using for more max effort training versus a beginner, maybe somebody who's squatting 200, 300 pounds. The weights are not all that different. You won't need nearly that much time to kind of ramp up to it. So beginners need, I think, less of like a true off season, and more advanced lifters might need a little bit more non-specific training from both a physical standpoint to get their body healthy and also a mental standpoint to just avoid burnout. Because let's be real, if you've trained heavy for any period of time, if you've done any sort of competing, you know what toll it can take on your mind to just be training heavy in kind of like a high pressure situation all the time. It can just wear you out. You can absolutely love heavy strength training. You can love competing. You can love the sport of powerlifting. But there are just times where it feels like work. There are times where it's just like not as fun. It just feels kind of like a chore. And I think that's pretty normal. I don't know if we can really get away from that to any degree. So I think one of the best things you can do if you're really feeling that way during your training is to just keep training hard to some degree, but just do something different, do something interesting. Include maybe more bodybuilding in your programming, maybe include some more athletic type stuff. I know a lot of our lifters enjoy doing more things like jumps and throws and sprints and stuff that you might think of more in like a sports performance setting. And that's a really good way to still train hard. And it's not like there's zero carryover to powerlifting with those lifts. It's pretty far removed, but I don't think there's anything wrong with getting a little bit more explosive and exploring some different movements to keep things fresh. I think there just has to be some semblance of the competition lifts still in your training, just so that when you do return to a little bit more specific training and you kind of go from your off season to more like in season, if you will, style training, that you don't have as much time lost, so to speak. You're not feeling like it takes so long to kind of get back in the groove of things, and hopefully you will not actually lose any of your maximal strength at all. Remember, the more experienced you are, the more your strength gains stick around, the less you're going to detrain during periods when you're not training as heavy or as specific. So it's not a perfect answer. Like, yes, I do think that especially more experienced lifters should probably have some sort of distinct off season, but you have to ask a series of questions. And if you're a coach and you're working with lifters and you're not asking these questions, I think you could become a lot better coach. by asking those questions and getting more feedback from your lifter. And if you are a lifter who has hired a coach and the coach is not asking you these questions, I think you should either remind your coach that these are things that you are concerned about as a lifter, or perhaps find yourself a better coach, because great coaches ask a lot of questions and build the program around the lifter and the lifter's feedback. The program is lifter centric, not like system centric or coach centric, if that makes sense. All right, no fish today, my friend, sorry. We'll give it another shot next week. Hopefully this is helpful, and hopefully it can make your off-season, quote unquote, training more productive.